Okay.
Thanks, Paula. Welcome, everybody. I'm Bruce Stewart, and I'm the chaplain at Goodwin House in Alexandria. And I guess I had something to do with getting Alan here today. We had a conversation in our network about having difficult conversations, that in some of our locations, it was a challenge to have some of these conversations about difficult topics. And it just so happened that I was in the midst of a course that our Episcopal Diocese of Virginia was hosting, and Alan was leading it on civil discourse. And it was about a 5 or 6 week course that involved online material that we studied and answered questions ahead of time. And then we'd meet together once a week through the Zoom format like this, and talk in small groups. We usually had a lead-in to help us do that, and then we divided into the groups to have more conversation. And it seemed to be helpful, and Alan seemed to be a good person to bring on to help us talk about this, get some ideas of how we can go forward in this. And Alan works in what's known as the Office of Government Relations for the Episcopal Church. It's part of the staff of our presiding bishop, and so he's a church relations officer, as you can see on the screen there. And I'm delighted, and I sort of suggested it to Julie, and she thought it was a good idea. We met with Alan a couple of times ahead of time to talk about this, and I don't know if Julie has anything else to say as introduction, but we're so glad that Alan could be with us, and welcome, Alan.
Great, thank you. It's wonderful to be here with you all. Is it possible for me to share my screen as well? At the moment, I do not have the permission to do it.
Let me give it to you right now.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, it's really great to be with you all today, and know that it's, in a number of ways, just bizarre circumstances in our country and many of our communities, and often I think we're finding ourselves struggling with more difficult conversations than normal, or perhaps more opportunities and the time that we're spending with one another to have those difficult conversations and have topics come up. So I really appreciate the chance to speak to you all briefly about sort of how we have approached civil discourse and how we view that as a practice, and then hear from you all hopefully about how I might be able to provide further guidance to you in your work. It is still not showing that I can.
Okay, I'll try it again.
Okay. It says to ask to make me a presenter.
Yeah.
That's what it's prompting me.
And you say yes.
It's just saying, it says I can now use keyboard control, but it's not letting me share screen.
Okay. Oh, okay, let me make you the presenter then. Let me see if I can do that. All right, now you should be able to.
Yes, thank you. Perfect. So you all should be able to see the slide now, I think.
Yes, good.
Great. So for civil discourse, and in a lot of the work that we do, I kind of want to give a brief overview of our office so that you have a sense of the context that we're coming from. But we look at civic participation as a means of building a stronger foundation for our common life together. That means participating in active voting. For this year, it means filling out the 2020 census. And it means advocating on policy and legislation that can improve the communities that we live in. The Episcopal Church, our Office of Government Relations, was created in the late 1970s. And most mainline Christian denominations and other faith groups as well have some sort of advocacy office or advocacy presence in Washington, D.C. to advocate to the U.S. federal government on a number of different policies. Our office, sort of focuses on a broad array of issues. Some other denominations may have a particular specialty that they focus on. I think in the case of the Episcopal Church, one of our most unique value adds to that space are our connections internationally through the Anglican Communion and being able to hopefully positively influence U.S. foreign policy by leveraging those relationships. But ultimately, it's about this recognizing we have a common life, asking ourselves, how does our faith inform us to engage with each other in public ways, to support each other, to seek justice, in whatever shape that may take in the moment or with a given challenge. And of course, as a tool for doing all of that, we've built our civil discourse, sort of drawing from the experiences of our staff, drawing from the experiences that we have heard, engaging in a bipartisan way with members of all political parties on a number of issues. The goal of the office, again, we represent the church's policies. We do not create those policies, though. They come from our governing and our governing bodies, which I think is an important distinction. And then we try to educate, equip, and engage the church overall in the work of public policy advocacy. Some of you all, I don't think everyone on this call is Episcopalian, but for those who are, and even if you're not, you're welcome to sign up for our Fiscal Public Policy Network, social media and or emails. We send out action alerts to Right Congress, sometimes the presidential administration, depending on the issue, about once a week. But it's a great tool that we use to engage people in this work and teach them about, create opportunities for learning, really for ourselves as well, on the issues that we advocate on. The issues that we cover sort of fall into these larger categories, although there are a lot of others, from creation care or care for the environment, ending poverty, that's both domestically in the US and internationally, migration, refugees, and immigration policy, human rights and peace building, and then the last one in the middle is racial reconciliation. That one is more of a lens that we can use to look at other policies to see what are the racial justice implications for an environmental policy, or the racial justice implications for an immigration policy, and how can that inform our advocacy and the way that we move forward. To do all of this work, this is an image I like to share. There's a lot that's sort of public facing, and then there's a lot that happens behind the scenes. It's not meant to be sneaky or private. It just means there's a lot of work that goes into a lot of the public stuff that may seem simple on the surface. And some of you may be familiar with these types of actions, writing a newspaper op-ed, doing a press conference, public statements. These sorts of actions typically have a host of a large number of hours committed to them in discussion and relationship building and networking to help amplify the message and get it out there. So that's a lot of what happens kind of below the surface, the part of the iceberg that you can't see. So that's a brief summary of our office. Turning a little bit more specifically to civil discourse, I'd mentioned our election and census engagement, and then our civil discourse work as well. We kind of think of as like three pieces of non-legislative, non-policy based engagement as well, although certainly there are advocacy components to election engagement and the census as well. But these are just standard ways that we encourage people, hey, you participate, engage in conversation with one another, help. We encourage people to talk across difference, political difference, and share ideas, because really no one of us has all of the answers to the challenges before us. So with that brief overview, getting into the civil discourse curriculum itself, and sort of the key lessons that we take away or hope that people will take away from the curriculum. It's structured in a way that begins in looking at this inward capacity. How can we within ourselves develop our own capacity for civil discourse? What is civil discourse? How can we think of it and applying it? Is it a practice? Is it a discipline? Is it a moment? And then we move into sort of this outward growth. How do we bring that into the world? So focusing first on the inward capacity and civil discourse and context. Civil discourse has received, I think, very reasonable and justified critiques, particularly from more marginalized groups. And the main critique is that civil discourse is used to maintain the status quo. It's sort of a cop-out to say, no, we need to slow down, be patient, wait your turn. That's not an appropriate way to engage. And I think there are absolutely genuine examples where civil discourse has been abused in that way. However, we look at it as a tool with as a term with a pretty simple definition. It's conversation to enhance understanding. And as such, it's a type of conversation that is a tool for a particular place and a particular time. Sort of following through with this tool analogy, like any tool, it's not meant for every situation. It's not going to achieve everything for us. And sometimes there are other means of engagement that are required. And likewise, like most tools, you have to practice with them. You have to use them in order to be skilled and adept at putting it into practice. And so this inward capacity for civil discourse, I think, what does that get us? I like this quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Here is the true meaning and value of compassion and nonviolence. When it helps us to see the enemy's point of view, to hear his questions, to know of his assessment of ourselves. For from his view, we may indeed see the basic weaknesses of our own condition. And if we are mature, we may learn and grow and profit from the wisdom of the brothers who are called the opposition. And this quote, I think, sums up what we all can get out of the practice of civil discourse. It is not, it's centered around this inward sense of curiosity, of opening our ears and listening to others, making sure we understand where they're coming from, digging deeper, and then also, understanding that there's a sort of the inverse of that is a sense of humility. And when we are speaking, when we're sharing, to know that we don't always have all of the answers, we're not fully informed, and that's okay. But it's through our conversations that we're going to move forward more effectively together. And that's really what this introductory section is about. It's setting that up as a practice or a way of life. The next section of the material for inward capacity building gets into these tenets for civil discourse. And the tenets are sort of ground rules. You may all have done a seminar where what are the ground rules for the conversation? Are we going to respect each other today? And make sure we listen, don't interrupt, these types of things. And these tenets summarize some of those basic practices that really are applicable in daily life, but are integral part of the practice of civil discourse. Respect, which I mentioned, trying to understand, that gets at that curiosity component. Practicing forgiveness, disagreeing, and loving. It's very, in some ways, elementary things, in that these may be lessons that we try to teach our kids in school or at home when they're young, but as adults we find that they're actually incredibly difficult to put into practice, especially when it comes to issues that may affect us very personally, that we have experience in, that impact our loved ones. Political conversation and politics and legislation isn't just about impacting people who are over there. It really is about impacting our own lives. And each issue that we talk about, each issue that comes up is that way for someone, even if it's not that way for ourselves. So how can we then use this curiosity, this humility, this practice of conversation to learn from each other, seek solutions, and ultimately build a better world? So turning into that building the better world, perspective or side to this, and this outward engagement of civil discourse. The first sort of key lesson is this idea of values-based conversations, and to remember to begin our conversations acknowledging the values that support our own position and asking from others what are the values that support their position. Usually in doing so, we find that we discover things that we have in common with one another, even if there are disagreements. and that we can use that sense of commonality to remember that each other's human, to remember that we may be coming from similar spaces and have good intentions, but disagree on how to fulfill those intentions or how to carry them out. And I think it also speaks to holding this space for disagreement as a sacred one. The example that I like to use for this is a little bit simplified, but I think it's the point across anyway. And it has to do with healthcare policy. I think the vast majority of people in the U.S. want people to live the healthiest lives, have the best access to the best healthcare possible. But we disagree on to the extent that the government should be involved in providing that or in orchestrating that. And if we jump right into those partisan positions, we sort of simplify ourselves, we simplify others to this preconceived notion without acknowledging, hey, there's something that we have in common here. There's something that we both want to work for. And we see it differently. We see we're going to get there in a different way. How can we have a conversation about this to actually find not just middle ground, but hopefully a better way forward? So that's what we mean about beginning from a place of values. The next piece of outward engagement we talk about are the complexities of policy, and that things are not always simple in development, nor are they guaranteed an outcome. This, of course, may seem a little bit more wonky or specific to engaging with our government and advocacy, but it's also about our individual conversations in an election year like this year, when we may be finding ourselves having more conversations with friends, with family, internal thoughts with ourselves, and reacting to news articles or TV coverage of a given issue. Remembering that things are just much more complex than they're often made out to be is really helpful. This is sort of two images that represent this: messy in development and messy in outcome. I'm not a baker. I enjoy cooking, but I have not really picked up on baking much at all. So, sometimes we have an expectation something's going to turn out really great, but then reality looks a little bit different. The strawberries do look really good on that particular cake, though. But you see the point. I want to share two examples with this. The first example is about messiness and development. This is a lake in central Haiti. I lived in the central plateau of Haiti for a couple of years, working for the Episcopal Church there in economic development. And this lake was created after the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Haitian government created a hydroelectric dam that flooded this valley. And the people who lived in that valley were used to a relatively accessible water source that was clean water, flowing water. They were used to relatively agriculturally productive land. You can see on these mountaintops it's steep. It's not as conducive for agricultural production, whereas the valley was more level and had irrigation and that sort of thing. When the valley flooded, of course, they lost that land. They lost their livelihoods and literally had to flee to the tops of these mountains, which is where the town is now that I was living in. And so you could view from the perspective of the people in that town, the perspective of the people living in this valley, that the policy of creating that dam was an immoral one. It was not good. It was unethical, and perhaps shouldn't have happened. But you could also look at it another way. That hydroelectric dam now is a consistent source of electricity for Port-au-Prince, the capital of Haiti, and has helped improve quality of life there to an extent. And stimulated business development in its own way. And so from that perspective, it was maybe an ethical decision, a good policy to have implemented. So policy is it's messy in how it impacts people, and the fact that there are pluses and there are positives and negatives to a policy in different ways. And so we have to take all of that into consideration. The second example is about policy and outcome. I think you all are in Virginia. I think everyone is in Virginia. Hopefully that's correct. And I grew up in North Carolina, so very familiar with the plant that is on the screen here. It's kudzu, for those who do not know. But kudzu is not native to the U.S. It's an invasive plant, which is why it can take over, enormous areas of vegetation, like you see on the screen, covering trees, smothering shrubs and plants underneath it. But it's here because of what was supposed to be a well-intentioned policy to prevent soil erosion and protect agriculture investment across the South. They brought policymakers made the decision to plant kudzu as a means of that erosion control, and unfortunately, because of the nature of the plant, it took over, and the outcome was ultimately really messy. There's another great example of this in British colonial, during British colonial rule in India. There was a city that had a cobra problem, like the snakes, cobras, and so the British colonial rule implemented a policy where they essentially placed a bounty on dead cobras to encourage people to kill them and then turn them in, and they could get a financial reward. So what this did is people saw this as an economic opportunity, and they started to breed cobras to then kill and turn in for the reward. Once the government realized what was happening, they said, of course, we can't have this policy anymore. People are exploiting it. So they eliminated the policy, and suddenly there was no economic incentive to keep all of these cobras that people had been breeding, and so they simply let them out onto the streets again, and they ended up with more cobras after the policy was implemented than they had before the policy was implemented. And the economists that studied this coined that type of process, the cobra effect, where there's simply an unintended consequence of a particular policy or legislation. So I think these examples get to that humility part, right? It's not that there aren't answers out there, but it's that we've got to unpack them sometimes and really examine, how are our different perspectives going to be utilized? How can we unlock the potential that's there in our disagreement to get something that can be more productive, more just moving forward? And to recognize that this difference between each other is something that's holy. We talk about, of course, diversity and identity in a lot of ways, which is its own thing, and certainly plays a role here. But what I'm speaking to more are differences in perspectives, and certainly our identities inform our perspectives. But these differences in perspectives are something that's holy. We can share our perspectives as a gift to the ongoing work if we can do so in a way that is productive, that does not push others out or silence them or disregard them in a way that's counterproductive, that is harmful, and instead turn and rely on this sense of curiosity, this practice of humility, and the deep desire to engage with one another in conversation. The image that I sort of appreciate that gets to that point a little bit is I think this is from Senator McCain's funeral. And some of you may have remembered this moment, but President Bush is passing Michelle Obama a piece of candy, which apparently President Bush has done for a number of people in different times. But I love just the expressions on President Obama's face, on Laura Bush's face. I mean, it's just a tender, human, genuine moment between people who had, in some ways very similar policies, but kind of covered that up, and then in other ways had very different policies, and certainly very different people in different backgrounds, but they at least could see, there's this representation of their common humanity, that we can work together, we can be in this, we are in this together, and there are ways that we can move forward. So with that, I think I have I've spoken enough straight through. Just a very brief summary of the key lessons from our civil discourse curriculum and the material there. And I would love to hear from you all some specifics about what in your context maybe you're struggling with, and would be happy to talk through that.
If anybody has any questions, just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask Alan. I think this has been a great prelude to a good discussion, or possibly good discussion. So anybody with questions or comments, please speak up.
Maybe Alan, please, in the chat section, maybe give the information for how people can get in touch with the course as well, and some of those other courses that are available that they could make use of in their own situations. That'd be wonderful.
Absolutely happy to do that.
David, did you have a question?
No, I just finished my lunch, so I thought I would just unveil my cameras, and so Ellen and Bruce wouldn't be the only pictures out there. So
Appreciate that, David. It's good. Although for others, if you are having Zoom fatigue or GoToMeeting fatigue, please feel free to leave your camera off. Definitely understand that.
I think maybe one of the things that is highlighted by our situations is that having these conversations, like we had during the course that we took, we were having conversations sometimes with people that we already knew, but otherwise there were people that we'd never met before. Maybe we had something in common, but we hadn't had a conversation before. And where most of us are serving are in communities that are residential. So the people are there and they know each other to some extent. But oftentimes, conversations about really significant issues haven't taken place because I think people are maybe a little afraid about finding out what's really on people's minds. That someone who has been their friend all along may turn out to be somebody that they think, oh, I don't know if I can have this person as my friend anymore because of what they believe. And so it's a two-edged kind of thing. People are familiar with each other to some extent, but they also don't know each other. And how to be able to recognize that there's significant things in our life that we are able to still have conversations about, that we don't stop being people with strong opinions or interest in shaping the world around us, and having responsibility in our society.
Sure, and I think that's a part of the section on tenants talks about certainly this need to be aware of our own health, our own security, and engaging in conversation. And so the expectation of civil discourse, the expectation that we're encouraging is not for people to put themselves in situations where they'll put themselves up for abuse or any type of discomfort that is unreasonable for their well-being, because certainly those types of conversations and differences in opinion can be very, very strong. And it may not always be up to each one of us to talk with someone who has very different views than we do about those views or about that issue. That said, I do think there is an overall concerning movement of partisanship in the country, of course, but I think more specifically, or as a piece of that, this attachment that we are developing between our political identity and opinions and who we are as a person, and overemphasizing that aspect of each other. And I think the statistics that I think are telling to this are around like mixed marriages. So of course, at one point it was interracial marriage that was not supported very highly. Now the percentages are fairly strong in terms of the support for interracial marriage. Support for same-sex marriage has trended in the same way. Support for same-sex marriage has grown. But the area that has gone the other direction is political party affiliation. People are much less likely to support their son or daughter marrying someone of the opposite political party. And that to me is really concerning to an extent. And I think we've got to keep in mind that both ourselves as individuals, but the people that we're engaging with are bigger than their opinions. They're bigger than their perspectives. And so how can we leverage this curiosity, leverage our humility, leverage our this practice and discipline of listening in order to create a space that can lead to healthier exchange, and keep in mind that we are more human than just our political positions.
Yeah, I think this is Lynn McIntyre from Westminster Canterbury, Richmond. I'll turn on my camera here. I really liked what you said about the fear of creating division, and we're having discussion groups on racial reconciliation coming up at Westminster Canterbury, and we put out a book list, and I got a call from a resident saying that she felt like the book list was really one-sided, and she feared that talking about race was going to cause division within our community. So what, I had the thought that everybody's already feeling isolated. Everybody's already feeling apart from each other. So to have discussions that are controversial, I think it's really helpful what you put out there, Alan, about the rules or the ideas that there's more that unites us than separates us, and that if we can form a way to listen to each other in times of disagreement, that it can build community rather than divide us. And I think the fear is people are already like, well, they're not going to like me anymore. They're not going to want to talk to me anymore. This is Richmond, right? So, so I think that the emphasis for us is really going to have to be helping them really understand the purpose of civic dialogue, and conversation with each other, and how that can be strengthening even if we do disagree. Because I think people are fearing that it's going to separate people even more than they already are. People are worried about that.
Sure, and that I hear about that fear frequently, and I think part of sort of two things. One, speaking to this curriculum and why we promote the practice of talking about how we talk to one another. It seems like a step backwards, but I think it is in part about getting around that fear, because before we jump into a particular topic, if we can talk about, okay, how are we actually talking with one another? How should we be talking with one another? What makes sense? What practices can we build and work on? We may not be perfect with it at first, but we can all say, okay, we're learning from this material. We can see how civil discourse is a practice we can build on it and be useful for us, and then we can start applying it to something.
Yeah.
That's sort of one part of this. And then the other piece is that I think ultimately a lot of the division is not just like, ooh, I'm uncomfortable in my opinions, but it's their actual tangible divisions in people's experiences and the level of justice and equity that they experience in their lives. And I think that is emphasized or kept in place because people are not talking to one another. They're not addressing these things. They're not taking the time to read and educate themselves about injustices, about maybe their own involvement in it, whether they're conscious or unconscious of it. And so I think even though the discomfort and the fear is there, I understand that. It's also, I think, not a neutral position to just disengage. And I think that's that's what has led to a lot of trouble historically. I think that leads and maintains a lot of the suffering that we see now. And so how do we choose a better option by engaging with one another?
That's really helpful. That's really, really great. Thank you.
Yeah.
One of the aspects of the course that was really helpful to emphasize, and I think you also just mentioned it too, about the listening aspect of listening to create the space, that it's not designed to get a point across, that we're not there to convince other people of our correctness. It's about listening to people and finding out where they are, and finding out whether we're actually hearing each other. But that was one of the significant aspects, I think, of the conversations, was about listening.
Yeah, it's a hard practice, Bruce. It is. And when we're not used to a deeper type of listening, it is uncomfortable. There's discomfort in these types of conversations, and there's discomfort in the process. But hopefully, my goal is, at least with this material, is to help alleviate that. And to say, here are ways we can engage, and to also acknowledge there are times where we shouldn't engage, that it's okay to step back, it's okay to take time. If we're feeling overwhelmed, if it does not feel like the right space at this moment, but to keep returning to these practices and try to use them as we can.
Another definition that came out of that for me was the difference between a safe space and a brave space. That we're not talking about making a safe space that where nobody gets ruffled. They are discomforting conversations, but it's a place where people can be brave enough to be honest, and to hear the honesty of others, the truth that's there, to make room for that.
Yeah, that's a great point, Bruce, and I like that, the brave space, safe space sort of comparison as well. And I think usually if a space is safe, it's often with particular exclusions. It may be safe for certain people, but others may not feel safe there. But within those little safe echo chambers, where it's hard to be aware of that. A brave space is completely different. It's a different approach. It's hopefully more open, more inclusive, but in a genuine and real way, not one that is just for the sake of having difference in the room, but saying, what are we doing with this difference? How are we seeing it? How are we acknowledging it? But others on the call, any questions on how this applies to your work, or ways that political conversations have come up in your work? An example that's been difficult for you to handle or overcome, or is unsettled?
I'm not sure if it's a question or just a comment or something. At Leading Age Virginia, I've been calling a bunch of different people and talking with them about diversity and inclusion and how they're handling it in their communities, because we do want to have a webinar series on, how do you bring more diversity into your staffing? How do you bring more inclusion into your residents? And it's interesting that the folks I have talked with from different communities have said that it's easier in talking with residents and they'll bring a group of people together and they'll begin a conversation, and they find it's a lot easier with the residents to talk about it. Whereas when they try to bring the staff together, it's not so as easy as it is when you're talking with the residents. So I found that a little bit disconcerting, and so I just was wondering, how do you kind of approach that with staff, or how do you approach it with just an individual that you may be talking with wherever, and they don't know these rules that you've just laid out on the tenants and the things like that. Mm-hmm. You just really want to have a nice conversation, and then they're starting, as you said, they're trying to pull you into their way of thinking, and that's not what the conversation is about or supposed to be about.
Sure. I mean, I think a couple of thoughts that I have on that, and I've received similar questions before. One is just the need for patience, and patience is so hard to, knowing, like you said, other people may not have gone through this curriculum or think anything of civil discourse whatsoever, and so that presents a challenge. I mean, I do think there's an uphill battle here in our work around this, and that ultimately it's got to be increasing our whole community's capacity for this type of work. It's not sort of just like, ooh, I've got this, in my toolbox in my pocket, so I can go out into the world and use it. It depends on a collective capacity for engaging in civil discourse, and those collective dynamics, I think, are different than our individual ones. So that becomes a challenge when you're in groups that have different experience with it, that have different identities and may hear each other differently because of those identities, whether that's age or gender or race or nationality. And I think one of those unique cases, which isn't necessarily an identity, but it's employment status and employment relationship. So I would suspect one of the reasons why it's easier to have such conversations with residents is there's probably a less direct tie between the person's own livelihood and the people that they're talking with. Whereas on the staff, that's just a different type of relationship, whether or not a supervisor is in the room or not. And I know that has presented challenges for people before. People have asked, well, I can't, if my boss is putting me in this bad position, I can't speak out. I can't use civil discourse back because ultimately there's that leverage over me. And that's a tough position. I mean, that is, a reality, and we can't control what our colleagues do, certainly. And so that, I think, is a dynamic to be aware of. And I don't have an answer, a clear answer for how to overcome that. But that's what I have seen in other contexts. It's that employment dimension, that employee-employer relationship that ultimately changes it and can make it difficult to overcome. I think we're seeing that a little bit on our own, like on the church-wide staff. We've just recently started more focused conversations only among staff about racial justice and race relations. And I think I've sensed some anxiety and apprehension around how much can I say. And it's different. It's a different environment.
We're just sort of on the cusp of these things. I think probably a lot of our communities are, of trying to find ways to have the conversations about race and anti-racism and what to do, what steps to take. And one of the things that we're doing now, this is not the first step we've taken a couple before this, but we're recommending to everybody to watch this PBS special from Frontline called The Class Divided. It's 53 minutes long. It was done in 1985, based on something that a third grade teacher did in 1968. It's fantastic. How she divided her classroom into people with blue eyes and people with brown eyes. And it was an extraordinary experience for them of what discrimination is about. Then it shows how this was implemented in another situation with adults. And it's very, very powerful. And so we're broadcasting it on our in-house TV twice this week, Wednesday and Saturday. And it's also available on the internet, on YouTube, anytime you want to see it. So if you search, say YouTube, Frontline, A Class Divided, and look for the 53-minute full-length thing, you'll get it at any hour of the day you want. And then we're putting together, we have a new Goodwin House Incorporated Committee on Diversity, Equality, and Inclusion, I think are the three names. And we're putting together conversations with residents and staff that will be something people can tune into. That'll be the following week. I don't have details on that yet, but that's an example of how we're trying to bridge these gaps.
If I can, I just want to share, we've had some local teachers who follow that model and were severely reprimanded for it. Yes, so that is not permitted. No. Just so you know.
In what way?
It was great. I watched that video. It was wonderful. Teacher tried to try it in today's day and age classroom and was, like I said, severely reprimanded for it. So it might work fine in the adult world, but it didn't in the child world. So at least not in that school district. We're all different from each other. Again, everybody's afraid of being not politically correct. Everybody's afraid of hurting somebody's feelings. Everybody's afraid, as we're discussing. So the safe thing to do is people do nothing, and that is also a problem. So, but I agree, it was a wonderful lesson that she taught the kids back then. And anyway, so I'd share that.
Yeah, and I don't think the object is for us to reproduce that. It's simply to observe what happened.
No, she did something similar to it, but
yeah.
It's really hard when everybody feels their hands are tied all the time, and people walk on eggshells all the time, and there's such a division. And it's not that everybody has the same belief system. So if you don't have the same belief system, you just stay quiet, because there's no point in voicing an opposite opinion. I think a lot of people feel that way. And so it is this tough time for our time. I mean, we had these conversations when I was in college in 1980 and 81. I mean, the division was huge even then. And it was just tough conversations to have. And people don't want to listen, and everybody wants to wag a finger and prove their point, and it's just makes it more difficult. But anyway, just thought I'd share that piece. Thank you.
Now, where are you calling from, Wendy?
I'm with Westminster Canterbury of the Blue Ridge in Charlottesville.
So it was in the Charlottesville area where someone attempted something like that?
I believe so, yeah, that was my understanding. It was, that video was posted to Facebook, and there were a lot of comments, and friends of mine who live in this area were the ones who told me that's what happened in their school district. So I expected somewhere around here, but don't know for certain which one, and that didn't matter. The point being that, you know, people's hands are tied as to what they can or cannot do, and this racially, not just racially, but just charged times in general. So.
Yep. Thanks for sharing that, Wendy. That's
sure.
Sort of prompted a few thoughts. One, back to Paula, to your question, is, you know, how in thinking about having such conversations among a staff, you know, what not only is it is there the dynamic of the employer employee, but it's also sort of like what protections or assurances are you going to have in place for me if, you know, we're trying to induce these types of conversations, or how am I as an individual empowered to speak to others on these difficult conversations, or respond to insensitive comments? I think that can be another barrier to people speaking in that type of relationship. You know, and I think to the anxiety that we feel, I mean, and this is, again, it goes back to the critique that I mentioned of civil discourse at the beginning, but where we're trying to thread a needle here. You know, on the one hand, we've lost, I think, so much ground in and maybe never even had it, in our ability to have conversations with each other across genuine political and identity difference, that we've got to slow down and really focus on that. And in slowing down and focusing on that, you know, may mean building up our confidence in our ability to do it. So one of the recommendations I have for groups that are apprehensive in engaging in advocacy or apprehensive around political issues is to find, as you're transitioning from the material of this curriculum, if that's what you're working with, which focuses on how we talk to one another, to then applying that to certain issues, is to start with ones where you can hopefully build group confidence. Don't jump right into the most contentious thing in your community, but say, you know, find something that is one of the terms we've created is pre-partisan. So I don't know that anyone in here can tell me the Republican or Democrat position on self-driving cars. There really isn't one yet. Hopefully it doesn't get into that, you know, partisan dynamic, but finding an issue that's like that, finding something that is less directly significant to the group so that you can talk about it and then slowly build up to things that are more contentious, is a helpful way to move forward, I think. That said, you know, the existing dynamic is that, you know, time isn't standing still. Injustices are alive and happening and impacting people now. And so sometimes that creates a genuine sense of urgency, need, a genuine defensiveness, and a reaction that may not seem productive or helpful to the group and the conversation, because again, as I mentioned, these issues aren't just sort of happening to those people over there. They're happening in very real ways to ourselves and those that are in our communities. So there's a tension there, right, between this urgency for action and this urgency for change, which has to happen, and then this question of how do we go about it? How do we bring more people along? How do we have conversations about finding a way forward with each other in a way that's hopefully more productive than just the silence and separation that we have?
Are there any other thoughts or questions from anyone? Our time is running down. Let's see.
Teresa, I see your comment. Yeah, education is a tough. Education's tough. My mom was a teacher for a while and left decades ago as well. I mean, my mom and I disagree politically pretty strongly, but I think we share our perspective on how difficult it is to be a public school teacher and private school teacher, and the pressure that comes from parents, the pressure that comes from, do you present competing ideas or not? And yeah.
Well, Alan, I want to thank you so much for this. I'm looking at the course going, this is a great course. Maybe we should all take it. So thank you for bringing so many ideas and thoughts that we really need to think about on a personal level and then on a community-wide level as well. And I know that it sounds like a lot of our communities are really starting to do something about it, about the discussions, about the conversations, about what we do with the diversity and inclusion as well. So this is just another helpful tool that we have received today, and I appreciate what you have put together and what you have done for us. So thank you very much. And Bruce, thank you for getting him for us too.
Well, I'm very, very glad that Alan was able to be with us. You know, when it came up and Julie had somebody she knew and was able to get for us right at the beginning. And I said, well, I don't know if Alan's available, if he can do this, but I think this is another speaker that might help us out in this regard. And so I'm glad you're able to be here and share with us. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you all for the invitation, for the time today. It was a brief time, but I do hope that we can stay in touch. I can put in my email address as well, actually.
That'd be great. Yeah.
I can type it. I literally wrote email address. That's not helpful.
I am going to send out the recording as well as the courses link that Alan has given us to everybody as well, all the social workers and all the chaplains afterwards. Hopefully once I get the recording onto a YouTube.
Yeah.
So.
And the curriculum the course is designed in a way that there is a group version, but you can also take it as an individual. It's modular, they're like videos and then kind of quiz and discussion questions in between. And I'm one of the 5 speakers, and then the other 4 are just wonderful, wonderful people. I thoroughly enjoyed working with them, and hopefully you enjoy learning from what they have to share on their videos as well.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for being on the call. If you have any other questions, maybe you can shoot them off to Alan. I'm sure he'll appreciate that and respond accordingly. So thank you all.
Thanks.
Thanks.